11th. I am calling this meeting of the Metropolitan Council to order. Good afternoon. And I hope everybody's feeling healthy. We are keeping our social distance.
Right.
Is there, first order of business is the approval of the agenda, and I'm making one slight modification to that agenda. The business item is the Metropolitan Council member committee assignments. There's just one tweaky piece of business we'll do 2 weeks from now. Most of that has been in place, so that's not on the agenda. But is there a motion to approve the agenda with that amendment?
So moved as amended.
Thank you, Phil.
Second.
Thank you. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Oppose? Right. And now the minutes. Is there a motion to approve the minutes of February 26th?
Move approval.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thanks. Any discussion or additions, subtractions? No? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? It is adopted. We now have an opportunity for the public to make a 3-minute statement on any item that's not on the agenda. And I have not gotten any notification, so this is the last call. We're kind of boring today. All right, so now go to the business section and start with the consent agenda. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
Thank you.
Second.
Thank you. I was looking at you. Thank you. Any discussion? Questions? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The consent agenda is approved. Now a report to the standing committees. The Community Development Committee is in the consent agenda. No report from the Environment Committee. Oh, there is. I'm sorry. I believe we have one action.
That's me.
Councilmember Lindstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Business item number 2020-99. Same week requests a joint powers agreement with Minnesota Pollution Control Agency for the Watershed Outlet Monitoring Program. The original JPA, Joint Powers Agreement, in 2018-19 included $300,000 for the council reimbursement on eligible expenses. This amendment will roll over unused monies from that original agreement and add an additional $238,500 for this year and the following year, for a total amount in grant funds of $538,500. The amendment allows Environmental Services to continue to monitor 6 tributary streams and river segments in the council's Watershed Outlet Monitoring Program. In addition, this amendment will move Riley Creek from the MPCA's program due to budget cuts and add it to the council's program. So, Mr. Chair and members, I move that the Met Council authorize its regional administrator to negotiate and execute an amendment to Contract 17G000 with the MPCA to extend the termination date to 2022 and accept clean water funds from the Minnesota legislature in the amount of $238,500.
Is there a second? Thank you. Any discussion? All right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That is approved. No reports from the Management Committee. There is a action in the Transportation Committee. Councilmember Barber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, council members, business item number 2020-56 is for the purchase of plastic passenger seating parts for Metro Transit Light Rail, contract 19P210. This contract is to design and produce seat parts that are less resource intensive to clean, disinfect, and maintain than the cloth-covered seating currently in use. The Office of Equal Opportunity has reviewed this procurement for contracting opportunities for small businesses. There were no DBEs available to manufacture or provide this seating. No DBE goal was applied to this procurement. An invitation for bids was opened on November 22nd, 2019. There were 3 plan holders and 1 bid was received on December 31st, 2019. An adequate competition determination was done per policy, and it was determined that the council's specifications were not restrictive and competition was adequate. New light rail vehicles arriving in 2020 in support of the Green Line Southwest Extension will be outfitted in plastic seating. The timely execution of this contract will ensure a uniform fleet appearance in addition to reduction in resources and labor associated with maintaining the current cloth seating. Therefore, Mr. Chair, I move that the Metropolitan Council authorize the regional administrator to execute contract 19P210 with Visual Productions Group Incorporated to design and produce these parts in an amount of $1,797,436.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion, questions? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? So that action is approved. We have a couple of, one a business item and then an informational item on other business. On the, oh, I'm sorry, I had to have my glasses on. We have a joint report of the Management and Transportation Committee. Is that Councilmember Barber? No, Councilmember Ferguson. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is for business item 2020-282, JTSW, body worn camera policy and public comment report. The summary of the public feedback report, the public was given an opportunity to offer feedback for the body worn cameras proposal between the dates of December 11th, 2019 and January 30th, 2020. Comments were accepted via U.S. mail, email, phone, and as well as in person at our meeting on January 8th, 2020. During this time, the Metropolitan Transit Police Department received only 8 emails, all in support of the body-worn cameras. Summary of the council policy adoption is that the purpose of the policy is for body-worn cameras succinctly summed up in the first line of the policy to provide a framework for the effective implementation and use of body-worn cameras by the Metro Transit Police Department. The policy also outlines the requirements for accountability, including the internal audit that complies with Minnesota State Statute 13.825, subsection 9. This item has been reviewed and approved by both the Management Committee and the Transportation Committee. Mr. Chair, I move that the Metropolitan Council accept the public comment report and approve the proposed council policy on body-worn cameras for the Metropolitan Police Department.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion? Yes.
I just want to say thank you to including the link on the use of force, as that is also goes hand in hand with the reason why we have body cameras, and it increases and enhances police and accountability. So thanks for that reference.
Right. Any other comments, questions? No? All right. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, that's approved. Now, on to other business. We have approval for an appointment to the Equity Advisory Committee. This is actually filling one vacancy, one member shifting, and then another new member has been brought on at large under the business item. If there's no questions or concerns, I'll entertain a motion to approve my appointments.
So moved.
Thank you. Any
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Great, thank you. Now, we're on to our information item. It's the final item today. The 2020 Equity Advisory Committee Work Plan and the 2019 report out. And we're very fortunate to welcome Lalima Satati Menani and Leah Goldstein Moses to make a presentation. Nalima Satati Menani. That's probably not right. Mune.
Introduction.
And thank you, Councilmember Gonzalez.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I'm just decided to sit here for moral support and also to answer any questions from the members of the committee, of the council. And again, if I can just do a brief introduction of Nelina Sitati Munene, who is the co-chair of the Equity Advisory Committee, and Leah Goldstein Moses, who represents District H, which is Council Districts 15 and 16. And they both will do a short presentation on the Equity Advisory Committee's work and also present the draft 2020 work plan.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, council members, for having us this evening. My name is Nalima Sitati Munene.
I'm Leah Goldstein Moses.
So what we're going to present to you tonight, we'll give you an overview of the Equity Advisory Committee. We'll present some of the 2019 highlights. We're going to talk about some of the challenges and opportunities we have had as a committee since the inception, and present our draft 2020 work plan. And at the end of that, we're going to leave some room for discussion and questions that anybody might have. So in general, the Equity Advisory Committee was created in 2015, and that was following the recommendation of the Equity Working Group. And the purpose of the committee is to advise the council in its work to advance equity in the metropolitan region. The committee is made up of 21 members, and that includes 4 council members and 8 community members from various geographic districts. The Equity Advisory Committee is a committee that was formed because the community advocated for it. And this was after a lot of community participation in the creation of Thrive MSP 2040. So there was a great desire by community members to not just have a wonderful document created. The community wanted to make sure that there was going to be an accountability on the part of the Metropolitan Council to deliver on the promises of Thrive MSP 2040. But it was also the community saying that they wanted to partner with the council to address not just the challenges, but also in co-creating the opportunities that exist within our region. And so the Equity Advisory Committee was formed as a bridge, if you may, between community and, and the Metropolitan Council, so that community voice can be present and at the table when decisions are being made at a council level. Right now, that is the current list, well, at least as of a few minutes ago, it was the current list of the Equity Advisory Committee members, and now we do have District A's. The District A vacancy has been filled.
Great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our values and strategies. As Nalima said, this work really comes out of advocacy from the community, and we see that still carried out in some of the values that we hold today. We really prioritize meaningful dialogue and action. We look at ways of valuing community engagement and finding ways to represent perspectives of community members in the work that we do. We want to really emphasize in our work work that has system-wide effect rather than things that might be a one-off project. And currently, we're looking at aligning an equity framework with that system-wide lens. So we're trying to think about how are we really approaching the whole system from a framework of equity. We have some, we've been having a lot of dialogue over the last couple months, which I'll highlight in a moment, to help us think about this sort of internal role we play around operations, how the Met Council works, and then external, how the community is impacted. So I think I'll move on to talk about some of our highlights from 2019. In 2019, we had a lot of changes that were very exciting and also is helping to drive our work forward for 2020. We welcomed and onboarded a new co-chair who's sitting with us here, and as well as 4 new council members and 4 new community members. We bid farewell to some of the original committee members, and so we spent a lot of time over the last year transferring the knowledge and the systems that those committee members raised. In fact, unfortunately, one of our committee members passed away last year, so we had a loss last year as well. We received some committee input on the comprehensive planning process. We had a presentation about how the whole process works and gave some feedback about how there could be more community engagement throughout the process. And we submitted some formal recommendations to the council on 2 particular things: the comprehensive local planning process and then the human resources building diversity initiative. So we submitted those as formal recommendations to the council. Several staff initiatives came to us for feedback. There were many, so just as a highlight, I remember a presentation on the Regional Parks Equity Grant Program and us giving some feedback about how to really not just make the funding be focused on advancing equity, but how to really engage the community in setting some of those priorities. And then what's taken up a good deal of time, and I'll explain why in a moment, is creating a strategic plan for our committee and really thinking about how we can be strategic in our recommendations so that we're achieving those values of having system-wide impact from a community perspective. So we identified some challenges and opportunities, and I'm going to start with the challenges and then pass it to Nalima to talk about the opportunities. So we worked with an external facilitator and really articulated some ongoing challenges for our committee. For example, as a relatively new committee that was founded based on this value of advocating for communities and prioritizing community voices, we didn't have a lot of processes for how to do that. How do we gather those community voices, then how do we synthesize them and understand them and then bring them as priorities to the council? So we've been working on that. We also have identified some priority areas, which we'll talk about in a moment, and we are a lot more of our expertise is in that community realm, and so we're thinking about how to work effectively with the council to really understand what the council work is and how to really promote equity in that work. And then we want to make sure that as we're providing recommendations to the council, they're being heard, understood, they're clear enough, and that they can be acted on by the council. And ways to have that loop closed. So when we're making a recommendation, understanding where it's going, what kind of action has been taken, and then what any kind of follow-up is needed.
Sure. So in terms of the some of the opportunities, so a couple of years ago, I think it's about 2 years now, the Equity Advisory Committee, we did a 360 review of the committee, where we had been so far, and we got input from both staff, council members, and other community members about the work of the Equity Advisory Committee and what people felt was missing. And one of those things that came out of that is the committee created equity policy, and that was adopted by the council. The policy, part of what the policy calls for is for an equity framework to be developed, and we realized that, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And so one of the opportunities that the committee is still continuing to talk about is prioritizing the completion and creation of the equity framework so that we can be able, the Met Council as an institution can be able to operationalize equity. The way we think about the council's work as is in 3 ways. One, there is the internal operations of the council itself in terms of, staff and hiring and recruitment and et cetera. The other way we think about the work of the council is in terms of the statutory authority, in which the council was created and the opportunities to exercise the statutory authority. And the third way we think about the council is about the external investments of the council. So even in areas that the council does not necessarily view itself as having statutory authority or may not be, very clear or very obvious, the council does make critical investments in what it does. And so these are the three areas that we think about when we think about how the council can advance equity. And these are the areas we would like for the council to think about in terms of, how they can leverage equity in our region in this, in these three areas that they act in. The other opportunities is to ensure that staff is supported to develop strategies to achieve equity. When we did the 360 reviews, what we found out is that there's a lot of equity being practiced in different areas, but everybody is still practicing their own different form of equity, right? And so once again, the equity framework would be able to establish the principles and the standards so that we can have a standardized way of practicing equity so that everybody can be on the same page, and so that also we have clear staff can have the tools that they need. There's a clear strategy, and also that there are clear goals that are measurable so that we can be able to know where we're going and what we're achieving and what the challenges are. The third opportunity is to clarify the Equity Advisory Committee's partnership with the council. And so one of the things that we've been working on and really think critically about is about the structure and the infrastructure that can be developed within the council in order to make the work of the Equity Advisory Committee more effective. What does partnership with the council, between the Equity Advisory Committee and the council, look like? And we believe once we're able to clarify those things and have a definite process, the work of the committee will be more effective as a committee and more impactful both within and outside the council. So the Equity Advisory Committee is unique in that because our role is to advise the council on matters to do with equity, we're not necessarily, we're not like MPOSC that deals specifically with the PAC systems, etc. We have a broad reach, which is a good thing, but also very challenging for a large institution as the Metropolitan Council. And so the creating structure and having a clear process is very important for us to be effective.
So I'll talk a little bit about what we plan to do in 2020 to help drive that work forward. The first thing I want to say is we hope to center equity and access in all of these areas that we're focusing on in this partnership that Nalima was just mentioning. So as I mentioned, we are looking at our work both internally and externally. So some of the internal work we're looking at is using that framework in a way that drives attracting and retaining a skilled, diverse, inclusive, and respectful workforce, and then also ensuring that procurement practices at the Met Council are equitable. Then some of our external priorities are focusing on affordable housing, transportation systems, and then accessibility more generally. So looking at how the physical plant of the Met Council is accessible, how some of the other ways that the Met Council is communicating or serving its communities are equitable.
Right, and so in coming up with these 4 priority areas around affordable housing, public transportation, and procurement and accessibility, these are the same priorities that we also had for 2019. And in terms of the committee, it's the committee looking at what are some of the most pressing issues in our region and being responsive to those issues. And also, these are some of the areas in which we feel that if we were able to address equity in these specific areas, it would give us the biggest bang for our buck in terms of how we move our communities forward. The other work, like I mentioned before, that we would like to see accomplished today is, of course, the creation of the equity framework. That is something that we need to be able for our work as a committee to be effective. One of the other things we've talked about also within the committee is about working through a definition of equity within the council, a uniform definition within the council that can be used across, the council, so that when we mention the word equity, we are all clear about what we mean and what we are talking about. One of the other things that the advisory committee, equity advisory committee, wanted to present to the council is we know in terms of Thrive MSP 2040, the council has adopted equity as a principle, but one of the things that the committee would like to bring forward is the idea of considering racial equity. We all know that in our region, the biggest disparities, you could pick anything across this region, and the biggest disparities will be along racial lines. And so the committee feels that if we address racial equity, then we are going to be getting to the bottom of everything, and we can really address all the other issues that impact everyone else. And so that is a consideration that the committee is bringing forward to the council also, as the idea of adopting racial equity as a principle for the council. And with that, we'll leave it open to any questions. And these are some of the questions that the committee also wanted to have a discussion about. How can the Metropolitan Council tap into the expertise of the Equity Advisory Committee to inform council decisions, and also what does the council need from the Equity Advisory Committee?
Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I'll just jump right in here. So thank you very much for being here. Appreciate all your hard work. One of the things I'd like to learn more, maybe it gets back to that relationship with the committee and the council and the systems here, is when we have items that are working their way through our committees and then all the way up to the council, how is the Equity Advisory Committee being looped into those items? I could back it up. How do we determine which items should be sent? You can certainly, it's public, you can see everything we're doing, but we've talked a lot about equity. We've had certain items even on management committee, you name it, we are working to, I think, advance this. So I too have that question of when we had a committee of the whole session on equity, and we spent time on the definition of equity, and we have, I think, 2 or 3 definitions out there. How do we engage with your group in that? So I'll just leave it at that. It's just kind of that, maybe it's a Venn diagram, how we all relate to each other's work. And I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you, Chair. One of the ways that I've appreciated hearing around the input from the EAC, I'll use the example of our Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission and our equity assessment. We have so many equity things, but the equity analysis tool. An example was the staff brought the tool to the EAC for comment and input, and then brought that feedback along with feedback they collected from implementing agencies and others to the Metropolitan Parks and Space Commission. They had that conversation, shared that information with us. We then had that information as we were having our dialogue, and people asked follow-up questions about what was the perception about this or that. Staff relayed that if it was a part of the feedback they received. If it wasn't, then it wasn't. And then that feeds up to the CDC committee, where I try and share the EAC provided this feedback, and PAS provided this feedback. This is what that conversation was like. Then my colleagues on the CDC asked their questions. I think one of the parts that I don't think happens is that I don't know that staff looped back to the EAC to say, here's what happened because you gave us that feedback. That I think would be a nice closing of the loop part that you all mentioned earlier. But to me, having maybe even a document that comes along with, that identifies when we're getting that kind of input, because EAC is going to be one of the groups putting input on something. It might be another commission or committee or external groups. Having a document that travels with that item to share, here's the input we received, where it came from, and then making sure that we can then loop that back and provide that back with the final decision that was made to not just the EAC, but all the other groups along the way in that process, I think is helpful. I don't know that we go back to MPOS and say, hey, all that stuff you approved, we voted yes to, or we voted no to, so I think that's something that as chairs of or liaisons for those bodies, we can help facilitate making sure that that happens in our space. But I thought that process would work good, with the exception of that failure to loop it back.
Councilmember Chambliss?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your presentation, Ms. Tati Muneni and Ms. Moses. I think one thing that can help us to work together is the back and forth communication as well. The 4 representatives that we have on the council can provide us information. We have reports at our meetings. Perhaps we can periodically get reports from EAC as well, and then exchange information in between. I think that would be great. I believe that it's great that we have the same goals in terms of accountability, in terms of racial equity, in terms of how we're going to strategize to accomplish that. And the fact that you mentioned the statute authority, which basically gives us the framework for what our authority is, what we can and cannot accomplish, and how we can do that. And perhaps we can see barriers in the way that we have to adopt our policies and practices and come up with a strategy to overcome those barriers so we can increase access and opportunity. So thank you for your work, and I look forward to hearing and communicating back with you.
Other comments? Councilmember Barber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much for coming here and presenting today. I really appreciate it, and it's nice to see it's come a long way. I was part of the original founding group of council members when this first came to be. I did have one concern as you were talking, limiting some of the work from the EAC to really focus just on racial equity. When we formed the committee, one of the things we were really looking at was also having another pathway for discussions around especially people in communities with disabilities. You referenced the gentleman who passed away, and he had been our representative from that community for a long time. We do have some element from the Transportation Accessibility Advisory Committee, but that just really informs the Transportation Committee versus other areas that community or people with disabilities maybe aren't getting represented. And so I'm hopeful that you will reconsider some of that to think about how, because that is a voice that we need at the table too. I think that they also, it impacted pretty heavily with disparities. And so I would like to see that included back in some of the discussions.
Sure. So let me clarify that statement. It was not to limit the work only to racial equity. Accessibility is one of our top 4 priorities. And when we talk about accessibility, we're talking about the physical accessibility, right? What we're asking the council is to be intentional also about being cognizant of racial equity, because if we just promote equity in general and we're not intentional about considering racial equity, then we're still leaving a big part of our community behind, because the greatest disparities. So it is very easy to be equitable but not be intentional about racial equity. So it's the intentionality of of considering racial equity and recognizing that the biggest disparities are along racial lines. It doesn't matter even when you talk about accessibility. There are also bigger disparities within communities of color, even in terms of accessibility. So it's the intentionality that we are raising for people to be intentional, the council to be intentional about racial equity and not just equity in general.
Okay, thanks for the clarification.
Other thoughts, questions?
Well, I don't want to jump in front of somebody who hasn't had a chance yet.
Anybody who hasn't had a chance yet? Oh, Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to echo Councilmember Barber's comments about disability. Disability goes beyond just physical access. I mean, there are some people who are in a wheelchair or some other mobility device and need a ramp, but there are other sorts of access for people with disabilities in terms of cognitive things, visual, hearing, sensory issues. There are lots of different kinds of disabilities, and I think it's important that the group have representation from people who have disabilities and live with it every day. Do you have, Tommy, somebody I think is disabled, but besides him, do you have anybody else who has disabilities that are on the equity committee now?
So, Tommy has physical disabilities. We had this discussion when we were going through the interviews this year. There may be people with disabilities, but they have not self-identified. And so I know that is one of the discussions we had when we're going through the interviews about how do we get, I mean, like, as you said, I know we're not talking about accessibility. I know I gave the example of physical, but we're not just limiting it to that. But so how do we get to this? I think we have to find a way how we get to this question where where folks can be able to self-identify if they have a disability, for folks where it's not physical and where it's not obvious. And so that is something we can include or be intentional about when we're recruiting.
And I'll just add that one of the ways that we want to be really intentional about our priorities is through the equity framework, which we are in the midst of developing. And one of the underlying kind of concepts we're using in that equity framework is working towards designing systems and approaches and responses that positively affect those that are most affected by the system currently. As our chair mentioned, we see across our region that the largest disparities are along racial lines, and so that framework of really prioritizing where the greatest disparities lie also will have a result of benefiting those who are maybe not having those greatest disparities. It's a concept called targeted universalism, where you design for those who are most impacted and then also look to benefits that will accrue to others as well.
Thank you. There are other comments? Councilmember Atlas Ingabitzer?
Thanks. I want to just thank you for coming today. Two, I want to say thank you for doing self-evaluation on the work of your committee. I've just been here a year. I think many of us have been. We haven't done that in other committees, and I think it's really valuable to do that, and that I'm a part of. So I hope we can also do that evaluation. How's our work going? Incorporate that, but it's really important to do that, and you shared valuable information as a result of that. I also want to just affirm the need to clarify equity and how do we, across an organization that has such a diversity of activities that it's doing and work that it's engaged in, create a shared understanding that people can operationalize and that unifies a clarity about what does that mean. I often experience people think and really still confuse significantly here equity and equality, an equal part versus the equity as those in the field really understand it, and that there's challenges and barriers to people kind of jumping to that next step of evolution and understanding further. Frameworks bring that to life, and so I want to just affirm that I agree that in all large institutions this is what they're doing, and we're kind of behind the curve on that part. So I don't think it's radical or anything like that. We'd be joining many of our great state departments in developing equity frameworks for an institution like this. So I just want to do that. And I also want to just encourage us to really think in a growth mindset way, that when we say we're intentional about racial equity, it doesn't mean that we close the door on all other things that we have to make sure that we're doing and protecting. It's acknowledging that we have not been doing what we've needed to do as institutions, as communities, and it has left people behind that is predictable simply based on their race. That is not something you can do for other protected class groups. And so that is an understanding and a body of work that we really need to really sit with. That by saying that, by acknowledging we have this gorilla that's sitting on our chest, not allowing our elephant, not allowing us to move in the way we need to as a society in our state due to these crippling disparities that are based on race. And the last thing I want to say is I think it's just really important to use best practices too, and not talk about individuals' characteristics that they're protected class, private information about their disability status or other things, and to acknowledge there absolutely is other people, because I was a part of the nominating committee for the EAC, who do have and disclose other types of non-physical disabilities. But it's just want to make sure that that's not, we're not out sharing their private information in a public way that's identifiable for them. And thank you.
Councilmember Johnson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I, again, appreciate all of this. And again, finishing up year one here, I reflect back on my own experience with having committees in the city that I formerly led as mayor and council members that were appointed and then advisory to our work. And some had a very formal role in our work and were very tied to what came to the council as part of that public process. And there were others that were very advisory in nature, very important, but making sure that that connection to council was extremely important, and that we were on the same page to the greatest extent possible, and interwoven so that it wasn't a committee working in isolation to whatever degree that might represent, because I've found over time, and I'm not saying that that's the case here because there's variations, but it's having that pathway into the work that's very stated, agreed upon, has structure and process into it as well. Because we just had a council of the whole session on ADA upgrades and infrastructure improvements we need to make system-wide. And just as an example, you know, that'd be kind of great to have us all be talking about that, because I'm trying to look at it through the lens I'm given and listening to others through the lenses they have. But clearly, I would imagine that would be really interesting. And maybe it's went there. I don't even know. But I guess all I'm saying is to have this committee in its work in building a framework that I hope the framework isn't, again, a bit detached from the whole system. Otherwise, I don't know how there'll be the best outcomes possible, and even personal gratification in serving in the role. So I'm just mindful of burning out committee members who over time don't feel like that connection was there. Again, not implying anything here, but I think I'm sensing there's so much more to do, and how do we make that more impactful by formalizing or, again, mapping out. And maybe it's done and I just am unaware of it, but that's important so that everybody can be aligned in the work. Might still agree on things, disagree on things, but it's not relying on a report out at a last minute when things are really moving along without fully maybe having some of those learnings that would apply and transfer over to other things throughout the council.
Sure.
So as a way of clarifying a question I have is, when we discussed the equity framework, and we've discussed it as a council, you've discussed it in your advisory committee, we've had committee of the whole conversations on definitions, and we need to kind of spend more time on this. Would your work on an equity framework really be a recommendation for the council as a whole, or your advisory committee, or how do you see it fitting, and how would you like to see it in this process?
I think the general agreement is that, you know, there are various ways, you know, of developing, you know, frameworks in different institutions have used, you know, various methods of developing framework. I think what that committee does agree upon is that we definitely, you know, need to have, you know, the framework that will, so that we can have this unified vision around how, you know, we want to advance equity. And I think there's some initial work and conceptualization going on, you know, by staff I think by the oil staff that we could all, react to and give input there, and move from there. We could, I think, there are various ways of, of how the framework, how the framework could be developed. And I think there's some initial, at least some initial work, going on that we could all respond to and contribute to.
Great, thank you. I think with your point, and as I understand it, that we've all acknowledged that we need a framework for ourselves, how the work is informed in all the different activity, and and specifically this communication gap of how the council relates to the EAC and that it cycles back. And I really appreciate that we have 3 council members, your co-chair, Councilmember Gonzalez. I know Councilmember Spearner is just joining, and one other who couldn't be here, Chai Lee. So I'm not sure we're going to get it totally figured out today, but your presentation is really helpful for us to catalyze some additional thinking. And any other questions, thoughts?
Mr. Chair, sorry, if I may, just one last thing. And, having, been here a year, like most of you, except 2 of you who are senior anchors.
Our senior members.
Yes, hanging on to the historical perspective and insights. But, even on management, we're really trying to push on some of these things that you even brought up. And I don't know if you guys know some of the things we're working on. So, again, it's communication. Expecting that everybody's going to see what the public meetings are. I mean, I'm not even keeping up with all of the public meetings and reading and, being able to survive. I'm focusing on the things I need to focus on and then hoping I grab the rest of it. But, I think we're doing some great things, but I don't know if it's enough and if we're doing it the right way. And certainly we have an exceptional staff that's working and leaning into this and leading. But, it'd be nice to just ensure that some of the things we are working on, especially around, that affordable and accessible housing. We're putting some new money into that this year, a record amount. So anyway, just some things like that to make sure that, the work we're doing too is surfaced so that you guys can go, yeah, or oh my gosh, whatever need be.
Mr. Chair, I'm excited, well, first of all, just to build on what everyone else says, thanks for coming today, and thanks for the ongoing work that the 2 of you do and the entire committee. I'm excited for the framework. It's nebulous to me, the interaction. I chair the Environment Committee, and it's been a little unclear at times if I should be referring things to the committee, or if there are things that the committee could be looking at, the EAC, that could come back before the Environment Committee. You've got your work cut out for you for the year ahead around affordable housing and transit and council operations, but don't forget about the environment and the good work that we do. As you are likely aware, we have 9 wastewater treatment plants. As you saw earlier in the agenda today, we are involved in clean water, which has an equity component to it, certainly. And potable water, we do a lot of planning around drinking water, which has a huge equity component to it. So think about environmental justice and a role for the Environment Committee to play in your work plan as well.
Sure.
If not for this year, certainly for the months and years ahead.
Sure, thank you.
Councilmember Lindgren.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I just want to thank both of you and your colleagues on the EAC for the work that you do. As you pointed out, there's a fairly new body. We're still trying to figure out how this relationship works between Met Council and the EAC. Also, just to remind us that when we applied for these positions, we were requested by the governor to address equity, regional equity, within our application materials. So clearly, it's a priority of that administration. So the work that you're doing, the work that we're doing here, I think, is trying to meet that expectation and that interest in equity. And if I may, I have just a couple questions around the 2020 priority areas document that you shared with us, and specifically around the affordable housing. And the first priority about this convening, this regional convening, we're a big convening body. It's a big part of what we do within the region. And this might not even be a question for you from the EAC. It might be a question for our staff or others. But I'm just wondering, logistically, does the EAC have the support, the resources, the cooperation from Met Council internally to realize that goal of the regional convenings?
Well, the idea of the regional convenings, I think that would be, it's a part of what we have put forward in the work plan that we would like to see happen. And so it is a current question about how do we realistically make that happen? And that actually comes from, sits within the current housing policy plan. That is one of the strategies of the housing policy plan, calls for. I mean, we understand that, whereas housing is not an official system of the Metropolitan Council, but it is one of the areas that the housing policy plan identified that the council could, in its role as a regional planner, could play the role of, hosting regional convenings to amplify this conversation, around affordable housing. And also, the council itself does make investments that impact housing, and also is an HRA in itself, and so it does impact housing in that way. And the importance of bringing in the voices of the folks who are most impacted by the issue. In terms of, do we feel like we have the current support? Well, it's in the 2020 work plan, and so, we'll see. It's a conversation to be had about how do we make that happen. I think it's possible.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Chair, I'm sorry, I have two other.
I just wanted to add one thing to that too.
Can I just say, I had to interrupt and hold the thought for 2 seconds. May I ask the vice chair to handle the gavel? I just got called to a call, and I hope to come back. And I don't want to put a blanket on this conversation. We'll keep it going. But Molly, if you, or vice chair, would you mind? Can I trust
Over
you?
there?
Either way.
Meet in the middle.
All right, so just to add to that, one of the reasons that as a member of the EAC, I feel like a framework is so important around equity is it allows us to extend our influence above and beyond where we can actually physically be, because by having a framework, it can serve as guidance when people are planning convenings or when staff are doing an effort. So that is why I feel like a framework is so important. Is it lives above and beyond our 24 hours in a day.
Thank you. Thanks. And Madam Chair, if I may?
Please.
Thank you. And then on your, in the second priority area under affordable housing, it has to do specifically with Livable Communities Act and Livable Communities funds. And so it's really just put out there, I'm guessing you are aware of this, but there's been leadership change within the Livable communities. Ms. Beard has a very strong interest in starting to tee up 2021 discussions about the Livable Communities Act programs. We have early, so that we're doing it now or soon, and we're better prepared for 2021. And so I'm just sort of highlighting that or lifting that up as an opportunity for us to work toward that priority area. And the last piece, and this doesn't appear in your priorities, but again, just to lift it up as an area where I think we can start to really define the relationship between the council and the EAC is through our Parks Equity Grant Program. And as you know, we had our first round of grants just this last year. We've learned things from that. We'll have a discussion about what resources are available and how those should be programmed coming up in the very near future. And so there's equity right in that, the name of that program, which helps identify it as an equity area. But again, just to lift that up, and we'll be able to engage with the EAC on that.
Sure, and just to comment on that, so the Parks Equity Grants Program is one of the areas that the EAC worked with the park with the park staff on that, and also it's one of the areas where and there are several recommendations actually that the Equity Advisory Committee had about how the grants could be made, more flexible, actually, and more accessible. I think one of the challenges with this initial pot of money is where the money was derived from, limited what it could be invested in, and also who could access who could access the dollars. And so I'm glad you brought that up because so in whenever the next round of money comes up, I think one of the recommendations from the Equity Advisory Committee is considering where that part of money comes from so that it can be more flexible in terms of who is able to access it and also what it can be spent on.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Other questions? Yes, Councilmember Apples-Ingebrigtsen.
Maybe not a question, but one of the things I'm kind of curious about with my colleagues here, are you familiar with equity frameworks? So when you talk about the word framework, is that something that people feel like they know exactly what that is? Or is that something where there's uncertainty still in that space?
I'm uncertain.
So I think just correct me if I'm wrong, because this is what I share with folks when I talk about what a framework is. But essentially it's a strategic plan focused on equity that provides guidance around the key concepts the organization is going to implement and ties that with specific metrics that they're going to follow, like you would in a strategic plan in another way. And it covers the entire enterprise. So everything underneath it, everything within it, everything in there. Is that a fair definition?
It is, and in addition, I think the framework also establishes the values and principles and standards, right? So that is very, so for example, if we talk about, so we're interested in having, impacted voices around the table. And so I know the council has a community engagement, strategy, but what does that mean? I mean, it's going to set very clear standards about what is an equitable community engagement strategy and what would that standard be? What would an admissible community engagement strategy be so that we can say, yes, this is the kind of community engagement that would result in equitable outcomes for the work that we're doing.
And I just wanted to kind of get that in space, and if I have some examples of that from other municipalities, other cities, and things like that. So if people want to see samples of what that is, you can shoot me an email, and I'm happy to share that with you. I also just love this idea of how do we really use the EAC, its members, as thought partners, acknowledge, and I want to also be thoughtful, they can't do everything, they don't work full-time in these jobs. And so how do we build our capacity too and make sure that's a reciprocal relationship and just to honor that? But I also want to say that I love, Councilmember Johnson, what you were saying around we're doing important work. The members of the EEC are out in the community. Many of them are professionals in this space and other places, trusted folks. I also think it's a great opportunity for us to, and we don't have to necessarily have a meeting to share with them what we're working on around equity. And I know Sai's team pulled together a huge audit of all the efforts that people are doing. It's, I think, something we can maybe think creatively about. How do we share and promote what we're doing in our different efforts in the park space or on management or in environment, push the information their way so they know here is what we're doing around this. And if they have questions or see opportunities and can amplify and promote this in our communities, that's a great opportunity for us to kind of think about as well from a communications point of view.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? Yes, Councilmember Lundgren.
Thanks for that clarification. So Environment Committee Chair, if I have an item that comes before the committee and I think, this might be something that the EAC may be interested in, is the right channel just to shoot you an email and say, hey, you know what, this particular large interceptor project is going through a low-income neighborhood. It's going to disrupt a lot of people's lives for a long time. Is this something you're interested in?
Sure.
Is that the right way to handle things? I'm not quite positive.
Sure. So, in trying to establish like a standard practice, I think so the OEO staff usually provide us with support. So a lot of times, whether it's staff or other folks, they will contact the OEO staff and they will say, and the OEO staff will always bring it to our attention and say, this, because we do set our own agendas and say, this is coming up, and would would the ESC be willing to have this conversation? And would you be able to put in the agenda? Do you think it's something important that the ESC should discuss? Yeah. So I think that would be the surest way that we would be able to get it. Right, because I'm one of the co-chairs, but when I leave the ESC meeting, the rest of my life happens. So,
Same with all of us. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, Councilmember Alex Ingebrigtsen.
I think on that as well, to acknowledge we have fantastic staff here too, to leverage too. So some things I might have a wonder about, and I don't go to the AC, but I might email Cy or even catch Lisa in the hallway, and we had a great conversation about equity, engagement, and development in governmental organizations with some of her staff. So I think that's also that it's not all on the EAC. We should just I just want to echo that, and to acknowledge that I found our staff to be really we have a lot of great staff who are well voiced in this too, and I found and I've gotten lots of nice little secret notes and things from people saying thank you. Those conversations are valuable when we have them from staff too. That I think that that's something that we need to spread across and build the capacity across all of our different spaces, and to have these conversations and to feel really resourced well within each department. And I know there's a lot of staff who want to build this capacity too, and that makes them better at their work. It makes us more effective in the long run, and really it helps them advance their careers too, because these are the kinds of skill sets and knowledge bases that are required for the future. For now, they're required now, but we really aren't going to go anywhere if people aren't gaining them going forward.
Other questions or comments?
Madam Chair, if I may.
Yes, please.
I just want to add a couple of comments and clarifications, and just starting with, just want to share with the rest of the council that I have been fortunate to work with the folks from the EAC. I've been amazed at the level of drive, knowledge, enthusiasm, and commitment by all those volunteers who work many hours beyond the couple of hours that we have every so often, especially the chair. I just want to recognize Nalima, because she works tremendous hours between meetings, at 6 in the morning, at 12 at night. It's just amazing, the type of work and the commitment. And Leah, of course, I think we have a bounty of talent that it's underutilized in the EAC, and I will definitely encourage our fellow council members to think creatively on ways in which we can tap into this expertise and enthusiasm. And also, you're more than welcome to attend our meetings so you can see firsthand our discussions. And a couple of other comments is that because of that wealth of knowledge and experience, there's a lot of intersectionality happening in our regular discussions. And to Councilmember Lindstrom's comment about environmental issues, we have folks that have decades of experience working on environmental justice that are part of the EAC, and we do discuss those issues as well as other things that might not be part of our priorities, such as workforce training, labor organizing, criminal justice, you name it. I think we touch on every single issue way and beyond the core areas that we have identified. So when the EAC indicates that we are choosing some priorities, it's because we have so much that we have been discussing that we definitely cannot address every single point, but just keep in mind that if you have an issue or an idea, most likely we have already talked about it at some point. And the last thing that I want to make sure that we get is that regarding on the equity framework, there's a lot of work that has been done already, and there's currently ongoing under the Office of Equal Opportunity, directed by Cy Jordan. And the equity framework is under Mitzi Kennedy's purview at this point, and I think that process it's ongoing, it's getting finalized, and that framework touches on all the things that we have been mentioning today. It's comprehensive, it's based on best practices, models from other jurisdictions and agencies. So there's a lot of work that is happening already on most of the issues that we touched. So we just want to continue that work, but doing it in a way that really and fully utilizes the potential of the EAC. So thank you.
Thank you. I too would like to add my thanks for all of the work that you do. I think it's amazing. I think the timing that you're here tonight is perfect because we're just almost all except for the 2 seniors, are just finishing our first year. And this has been, I think we're all getting our own bearings on how we work and the work that we want to do. And I think this is clearly a priority. It's come up many, many times. Are we using the EAC effectively? Are we communicating effectively both directions? So I think this is really helpful. And it seems from so many of the comments and the questions in the conversation that much of this is based in communication. And then one of the things that I'm wondering is if we could get a copy of the agenda for your meetings and ahead of time so that if we are able to attend, that would be helpful, or if there is especially something environmentally that is a draw that perhaps Councilmember Lindstrom can make an extra effort, whatever. But again, just communication, seeing what you're doing and how, and vice versa, that we can be much more communicative about what we are doing. And I think that was really an important thing to close that loop, to come back and tell you, here's what we did with what we gained from your expertise, because I think it's just really, really valuable. So, Councilmember Chambliss?
This is just a really great conversation, but just wanted to reiterate that we spent many hours and we're not done talking about equity, and we're in order to get to the goals that we want and to close the gap, it's going to take a lot of time, a lot of work, and a lot of discussion. We also, as a Metropolitan Council, have the Thrive 2040 plan, which talks a lot about equity and our framework. And so I probably need to review that again and encourage other people to review that, because it really does get at outcomes and our principles and why we're doing what we're doing, and why we have in most of our documents that we approve the equity framework. But we got to remember why we have it there and what it means and what we should do with it and how we can improve it, because it's going to be a continual improvement process.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Thank you so much for being here. It's really been a great conversation, I think, and hopefully the basis for much more effective working together. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, now we can move on to our council member reports. Are there any reports that our council members would care to share? Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Thanks. I stepped away from the Forum on Workplace Inclusion. I know we have a number of staff, and I don't know if any of the members were able to take advantage of the opportunity to sign up, but it's been great, and good thing or a bad thing, but historically at the Forum, it's been a very international, national conference. I think due to the issues going on right now, 50% of the participants, about 900 participants are from the state of Minnesota this year. And so it's definitely a space where there's a lot of good local conversations going on, and acknowledging what it's like to see the impacts of what's happening so I think one of the things EAC brought up, which would have made a big difference, is if we were more flexible to be able to do things digitally at things like this conference, which is totally something that we could do. But even in our own systems, we could be not as maybe paralyzed by or hurt. So there was definitely a reduction in attendance at the convention center, but they've done a lot of amazing things there to keep people safe, change the way food is served, all kinds of things. So it's really pretty amazing to see. And I think it's a good learning opportunity for us to think about how we're resilient in different ways. But that's what I wanted to share today.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other reports from council members? Yes, Councilmember Lindstrom.
Thank you. Councilmember Fredson and I did a hat team ride along about a week or 10 days ago or so, and in the middle of the night. And I know you've done that as well, Madam Chair and Councilmember Vento, and perhaps others. And I definitely encourage all of you to think about doing that if you haven't. It is an unbelievable experience, a life-altering experience, really. I mean, because we hear from these from the podium here, at least I do, about the challenges that we're having in this region, and then it's another thing to see it firsthand at 2 in the morning or 3 in the morning when you see a kid riding one of our bridge buses at 3 in the morning, and that's like a day in the life of a member of our hat team, and I just was very impressed by their professionalism. And that the way that they are interacting with the residents on the train or the buses, that they're not just acting that way because I'm there or Councilmember Fredson is there, because that because of the reaction from the residents on the train. They're greeted by name often, and I just can't say enough good things about what I saw that night, even though the things I did see were just so immensely troubling in a lot of different ways.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for doing that. To expand on that a little bit, I think one of the things when I did it that I experienced is, and I've mentioned this, I know, is that every one of your senses gets involved. I mean, the sense of touch, the sense of smell, the hearing, the see, everything. So I think it impacts an individual very differently than hearing people talk about their experience or seeing videos or whatever. So that was quite stunning to me. I hadn't thought about that it was going to be sort of hit me in many different ways than they experience in other ways. And then I thought it was interesting too. I know that the officer that I rode along with said that, he was so proud of the work that he was doing. And so I asked him how he came to be on the hat team, and he said he was invited to be, and he could hardly believe what an honor it was for him, with just several years on the force, to be able to be invited to be a member of the hat team. That was just like really, really monumental in his career development. He felt it was such an honor and was so respectful of that honor, both in having been selected and then again with the individuals that he interacted with. So to echo what Councilmember Lindstrom said, if you haven't done it and you have a chance, it will change you for sure. So thank you for doing that. Anyone else like to report in? We have so much time.
Okay.
No? Okay. Regional Administrator.
Report.
Nothing. Okay. Ms. Bloodhart.
No report.
Okay.
Thank you.
Anything else? If not, I'd entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
The meeting's adjourned.